encourage questions. Our recording. Welcome to Learning to Grow, Understanding Self-Esteem and Self-Compassion. This is a presentation on the basics of understanding self-esteem and what self-compassion is. I really encourage everybody to take this material and apply it to your everyday life. But I'd also really encourage everyone to think about signing up for our longer group. In the fall, we have a group called From the Ground Up that also covers self-esteem and self-compassion with a lot of interactive exercises. This group will either be held in person or via Zoom, depending on who would like to sign up and how they would like the material presented to them. Those sessions will not be recorded due to confidentiality and the amount of sharing that is done in groups. So this is kind of an introduction to the material that is full-fledged within that group. So what are we going to be covering? So we're going to try to answer these questions. We're going to talk about what is self-esteem and what is self-compassion. Now we've split it up into two sections. We're going to cover self-esteem in its entirety first, and then we're going to talk about self-compassion. We're going to talk really about the connections between our thoughts, the environment, and our self-esteem, and how it all kind of interconnects. And finally, we're going to talk about being more self-compassionate and how we can accomplish that. Understand self-esteem, we really need a good working definition. So this is from a book called Self-Esteem 3rd Edition, and it's by Matthew McKay, and he writes that self-esteem is essential for our psychological survival. Without some measure of self-worth, life can be enormously painful, with many basic needs going unmet. So most of you probably have a good idea of what good self-esteem or what poor self-esteem will look like. But self-esteem really refers to a person's overall sense of his or her value or worth. Considered as a sort of measuring tool about how much a person values, approves of, or appreciates their qualities within themselves. So according to experts, self-esteem is quite simply one's attitude towards oneself. So we can have favorable attitudes or unfavorable attitudes towards ourselves, and there's a lot of varying factors that influence our self-esteem. Things like genetics. Our genetics influence a lot of the way we see and interpret the world. Our personality also affects the way we judge and see ourselves and the world around us. Those of you who have ever been called like a pessimistic personality will know what I'm talking about. Or those of you who have ever been told that they are optimistic. Those qualities affect our self-esteem, both positively and negatively. Life experiences also affect our self-esteem. So our life experiences can build us up or break us down or maintain certain thought patterns, which we're going to get into. Our age also affects our self-esteem. Health, the types of thoughts we have regularly. Our social circumstances and the people around us affect our self-esteem. Our reactions and behaviors, who we are around, as I said, so comparing ourselves to others really affects how we see ourselves and those in the world. It's a really important note that self-esteem is not fixed. It changes over time, meaning we can test for it and we can improve upon it at any age or at any time in our lives. So before we really talk about what low self-esteem is, let's start with the term self-esteem. You may have heard similar words like self-image or self-perception or self-concept. These are all terms that refer to the way we view and think about ourselves. As human beings, we have the ability to not only be aware of ourselves, but also place value and measure of worth on ourselves or parts of ourselves. It's an interesting psychological phenomenon when you think about it, that we are able to judge the world around us as good or bad, or judge our internal experiences as good or bad. So, as the slide says, there are basically two kinds of self-esteem problems: situational and characterological. So situational tends to show up in specific areas. It's situations. Whereas character is more of a global self-esteem problem, where it affects many areas of our life. Some examples of that would be a situational would be a person may have confidence in themselves as a parent, as a spouse, as a sister, even in social situations. They're like, I'm confident, but when it comes to work, they hold a lot of negative views of themselves and have lower confidence. So another example is people who are socially awkward. They may be great at their jobs, but not be able to interact with people very well or communicate well with people. And those are situational self-esteem problems. Characterological self-esteem is usually rooted in early experiences from when we're a child. And it's most in research kind of characterize this as someone that has a sense of wrongness in many areas of their life. So they often think of low self-esteem as in they never do anything in their work life right. They never do anything in their personal life right. You know, they're just overall a bad person. And that's a value that they put on themselves, and they believe it. The interesting thing is all of this can change at any point in our lives. Self-esteem, as I said, can be measured and can be built upon. So someone who has a global sense of self-esteem problems can build it up so eventually they have a more balanced view of themselves. Someone who has situational self-esteem problems at work can build upon that and gain more confidence and a more balanced view of themselves. So, thoughts and self-esteem. We can't judge things without thought. So we often have what's called a pathological critic. So something in our head that constantly describes every situation or that as something that is wrong. So we term this as our inner critic. So someone who is constantly this voice in your head that's constantly attacking you and judging you as negative. So people who tend to have a lower self-esteem tend to have a more vicious and vocal critic. The critic blames this person for everything that is going wrong, constantly compares them to others in a negative manner. Often will say, this inner critic will often say your achievements or your abilities are luck. That, you know, those aren't really good things, you just lucked out. That's what an inner critic will say. So inner critics set really impossible standards of perfection, and they tend to beat you up when you make the smallest mistakes. So what you can see in this slide is kind of how an inner critic will work. So as you see on the one side there, it says at-risk situation. So you have these unhelpful rules, these unhelpful assumptions in situations, and they get activated. These negative thoughts, these negative core beliefs get activated in this situation. So your inner critic will have these biased exceptions and cause you to have a negative self-evaluation. So then you have unhelpful behaviors. So on either side, you will avoid the situation. You will use drugs or alcohol or neglect self-care to make the negative self-evaluation, those negative thoughts, less intense. So we often people, layman's terms, would refer to this as like self-sabotaging or self-fulfilling prophecies, these types of behaviors. So if you say, well, I'm never good doing presentations, like I just suck at them. And so therefore you avoid any situation where you have to stand up in front of people and talk. Those are unhelpful behaviors for a negative self-evaluation, a negative thought that then proves to be true because you never practice, and causes a lot of unhelpful emotions, so which confirm the negative, what the critic is saying. You're not good at presentations, you avoid them, therefore you never get at them, you feel really anxious and upset when you have to do them, and it becomes this awful cycle, as you can see. Some other points about the inner critic is the critic often has a script, which we call core beliefs or thought patterns, on how you ought to live, and it screams at you all day long that you should be doing this and you should be doing that, and it tells you that you calls you names, calls you incompetent, calls you all sorts of things to make you believe that this is true. So back to that failure or that presentation example, you got anxious, therefore you're not good at presentations. That's not necessarily true. The inner critic's job is to exaggerate your weaknesses by insisting that you always do something or you're never going to be good at something. That's its job. But always and never are not necessarily true. One of the things I really want people to remember when it comes to self-esteem and your inner critic is that our thoughts are not 100% true 100% of the time. At one point, did you not do well in a presentation or a group project, or the example that I've been using? That may be true. Always? Does that mean it's always going to be that way in the future? No. In truth, the critic is kind of like the devil on our shoulder. Right? They're the ones that constantly whispering negative things in our ear. So one of the things that we have to learn is to balance these thoughts and kind of get the angel speaking up on the other shoulder. And we refer to that in From the Ground Up as, your inner cheerleader. There's lots of different terms for the angel on your shoulder, or the positive voice that fights the inner critic. But so it's really important to kind of balance these thoughts and saying, am I being too hard on myself? So what does healthy self-esteem look like? And that's really what we all want. We all want a healthy self-esteem. We all want to feel good about ourselves. and to be able to be more confident in ourselves. That means being more balanced. So healthy self-esteem doesn't mean that you never look in the mirror and say, I have no flaws. I'm perfect the way I am. Part of healthy self-esteem is really minimizing the distorted thinking that we have and increasing a more balanced view of ourselves. Accepting our weaknesses along with our strengths. And there's some really great exercises in From the Ground Up that demonstrate and increase this. One of those exercises is listing all of our positive features and all of our negative features and all of those meh features. So it's a really great way of taking a more balanced look at ourselves. There's always things that we want to be able to change. I wish that I had, blonder hair, so I get it dyed. I wish that you wish that you were 10 pounds lighter. You wish you were, when you look in the mirror, you're like, I wish my nose wasn't this way. But accepting that, your nose looks that way, your hair is that color, there are things you can do to change, but then there's parts of you that you can't change, that you have to learn to accept and embrace, because that's a more balanced view of yourselves. And that's the job of the angel on your shoulder, is to give you more of a balanced view of your strengths and weaknesses. So to raise your self-esteem, it is absolutely necessary to throw away what we call old warped mirrors, and learn to accurately perceive yourself. Who you are, your entirety, not just who you are and your strengths. And rebuilding that script. So as you can see from the image, the asks at-risk situation occurs. Your old negative core beliefs, that inner critic gets activated. So then you start using some tools. You start using things like looking for your distortions. It calls it thought diaries in the diagram. You can do this however you want. But recognizing that you have an imbalance in your thinking. So you engage more helpful behaviors. So doing things like approaching the situation with an open mind. Stop using avoidance, escape, and safety behaviors that reinforce that inner critic. That would be really important. Treating yourself well, being more kind to yourself, which we're going to talk about because that's the self-compassion piece. And not isolating or yourself or withdrawing from the world. So as that happens, your core beliefs, and this is why self-esteem can develop and change over time, your inner critic gets quieter. So you adjust your core beliefs. It's really important when we're adjusting our thoughts to be looking at facts. And so when you are going into a situation and you're like, I always suck at presentations. What are the facts of the situation? Well, you got one bad grade in a presentation in school. But how many presentations did you do okay on, or did you do great on? And it's balancing that. So you're not great at presentations, but you are capable of it. And writing those out, that is probably the biggest recommendation I can do, is write out those facts. Facts for that critic's thought and facts against that critic's thought. Because that's going to give you the balance. It's not about shutting the critic up. It's not about getting the critic to suddenly be your cheerleader. It's about balance. And finding out whether your thoughts are 100% true in that moment, which they're probably not. then you engage the more, or change the unhelpful behaviors into more positive behaviors, so you don't avoid. As things unfold, positive consequences end up happening, and you get more evidence for things not always being that way, or things never being that way. Those always and never terms, or must and mustn't terms, are really a good indication that that's a situational self-esteem problem. When you are constantly saying, I should always, I should, even should statements. It's about finding that balance. Okay. How do we do that though? We are a lot kinder and more empathetic to people around us than to ourselves, generally speaking. So often we say to increase our self-esteem, we need to be more self-compassionate. But compassion is an attitude that involves a certain set of feelings, thoughts, motivations, desires, and behaviors directed toward pretty much any living thing. And in this case, the way we're using it is ourselves. When we talk about self-compassion, we are being very specific about our attitudes directed internally towards ourselves. So this is how we build that voice that counteracts the inner critic. Self-compassion involves being aware of our own pain and our own suffering. It's about being aware of our inner critic and accepting that these feelings and this pain is happening. So if we ignore our inner critic, we're just causing more suffering. We want to accept that the inner critic is there first. So self-compassion can bring a lot of great benefits to our mental health and our well-being. Particularly, it can activate what we call our soothe system, so our system in our brain that reduces the threat alarms. And it can increase our drive system, so the system that spurs us on to do more, to be more active in our life. This is an important part because we want to soothe that inner critic, calm them down, make what they're saying less hurtful, and increase our motivation to keep trying, to move around and not believe what the inner critic is saying. So the opposite of self-compassion is self-criticism, which is our inner critic, which affects our overall self-esteem. So when you think about it, self-esteem is kind of this concept within our bodies and our brains. And self-compassion is how we build our self-esteem. So from what the slide you can see, how we build positive attitudes and thoughts towards ourselves is through understanding, acceptance, and forgiveness. We call this the compassionate response. So how do we get to understanding, acceptance, and forgiveness? How do we get to a more compassionate response to our inner critic? The compassionate response is really about acceptance piece. It's really about how would you respond to a friend that would say things super negative about themselves. You wouldn't say, oh yeah, you totally suck at presentations. That's not helpful. You wouldn't say that because it's not empathetic. So we shouldn't be saying that to ourselves. So to begin, ask yourself these 3 questions. What was the need, or what need was myself, he or she, trying to meet with that behavior? So what was I trying to do with avoiding doing presentations? What beliefs or awareness influenced the behavior? So why, basically answering the question, why was I doing that? What pain, hurt, or other feelings influenced the behavior? And this piece really goes back to this beginning piece, about understanding, that understanding piece of the compassionate response. First three questions. Trying to understand what your inner critic is doing and why you behaved in a certain way. To move on from there, we ask these next three questions, which is about acceptance. So it's about taking judgment or blame out of the equation and understanding the choice. So we say to ourselves, or we say, I wish that hadn't happened, but it was merely an attempt to meet my needs, which feeds into that first question there. Then we say to ourselves, I accept without judgment or feeling of the wrongness of that attempt. That attempt, avoiding things like that, probably wasn't the best idea. But I accept that I did that, and it's okay. This one is really hard because a lot of people assume that acceptance means agreement. You can accept that something has happened and disagree with it. So it's acceptance of the facts. The facts are, this happened and it was wrong. Then we move on to number 6, which is, no matter how unfortunate that decision was, I accept the person who did it as someone who is, like all of us, trying to survive. So I accept that I did this. I accept that I did this because I was trying to avoid something. So we say these 3 statements. Really, these are more of a question. And then we move on to forgiveness in our equation here. So forgiveness is these final 2 steps. So we understand first 3 questions. We're write these questions out. We understand what it is. Then we move into acceptance, and then we move into our forgiveness piece. Because accept things and not forgive them too. Sometimes this transition between acceptance and forgiveness is really difficult. And again, forgiveness does not mean that you are completely okay with someone else's behavior or with this behavior or the way this critic is talking to yourself. It really is just kind of letting things go. Reminding yourself, well, that was over, and I can let go of this. Did it change me? Whatever the situation was, yes. But I can let go. It's okay not to hold on to that experience. And nothing is owed for this mistake. It's the final piece. So it's not an eye for an eye kind of situation, is what that last one is saying. It is you know what, mistakes were made. I said some negative things. I avoided some things I shouldn't have, whatever. When we're talking about self-compassion, we're talking about our own behavior. So we want to direct that towards ourselves. I don't have to punish myself for this mistake that I made. I can move forward from it. So take a picture of the screen, do a screenshot. We really want you to kind of memorize this sequence. and make a commitment to use it whenever you notice that you're judging yourself or even others in a way that is really harsh. You can change the language, you can change the steps to fit more of your own personality or for something that makes more sense for you. But this is the basic sequence. We want to ask questions about understanding, make 3 statements about acceptance, and then finally make 2 statements of forgiveness and letting go. You want to maintain the basic thrust of the compassionate response: understanding, acceptance, and forgiveness. And that is how you move forward. Now, we often get questions about, well, what is my self-compassion actually like? So this website, selfcompassion.org, test-how self-compassionate are you, is a really good scale on understanding your inner critic and your self-compassion. So it's written by a pioneer on self-compassion and research. She's been studying this for a very long time. Her name's Dr. Christine Neff. This website also has a lot of videos talking about self-compassion and how we can improve it. The test itself breaks down your self-compassion into areas of improvement. So it talks about like self-judgment, which is our inner critic. It talks about behaviors like isolation and so forth. So it can kind of give you an idea. It calculates a score on where you can increase your self-compassion. And you can do this test several times, thinking about situations or your overall character. This is one of the exercises that we do in From the Ground Up to kind of discuss areas that could be improved and put in a plan in place to meet that goal. So, presentation, this is, like I said, about half an hour on self-esteem and self-compassion. And if you would like to learn more or build more self-esteem or learn more hands-on tools, please sign up for our 8-week group called From the Ground Up. And it will be coming this fall. We should be running it via Zoom, I believe. If not, we'll be running it in person at the Trenton MFRC. And we run it probably a couple of times a year. And I really hope people will take advantage of it. If you have any questions, concerns, or insights into self-esteem and self-compassion, please email me, and thank you for partaking in the webinar. I'm going to mail participants a feedback form. I really appreciate it if everybody can return it. If you are watching this on YouTube, please email me, and you can also give me feedback on the presentation. I would like to improve upon it, answer anybody's questions, anything that I missed going forward. So I have a small poll to share with you before we start, before we end. Poll's not working. We did get one question from a participant. It is repeat my saying. And I do say this all the time. Our thoughts are not 100% true 100% of the time. So basically what it means is just because you think it doesn't make it true. It's that age-old, is that a fact or is that an opinion kind of analogy. And honestly, I should probably have it up in a poster in my office because I say it probably daily. I want to thank everybody for participating, and we will hopefully see you guys in more of our groups. Thank you.